Good afternoon y bienvenidos. I am Elizabeth Alexander, president of the Mellon Foundation. I would like to begin by saying hello and hola to all of you who are typing in the chat. It is rocking and rolling over there. It is wonderful to see so many people tuning in from so many different places. We will be conducting our discussion this afternoon in English, but as you noticed when you registered for the program, there is also live Spanish and ASL interpretation and captioning available. So please email events, EVENTS, at mellon.org if you would like a link to watch those streams. Regardless of how you're participating, I invite everyone to tell us where you're from in English, Spanish, or any language you speak, and as the conversation continues, to share your questions with us. It is truly exciting to see the conversations that happen and the new connections that are made through the chat during our Mellon events, so we hope you will continue to engage with each other in our program today. It is now my great pleasure to welcome you to our discussion, Creativity and Cultures in the Borderlands. The region we call the Borderlands, a physical place that is marked by the political boundary of the United States and Mexico, is home to a vast array of cultures, languages, histories, and identities, all of which are coming into contact with one another each and every day. Spanning 2,000 miles along 4 U.S. states and 6 Mexican states, the Borderlands are home to roughly 15 million people and more than 150 Native American tribes and 25 Native American nations. At least 7 indigenous homelands and peoples are intersected by the boundary of the border. It is a physical barrier that represents centuries of racialized policies and policing and remains an ongoing site of contestation and separation. Given its remarkable geographical and political range, the region is a regular focal point in American debates around immigration and national security, and yet that focus too often elides the essential histories and cultural traditions preserved and passed down through generations in the Borderlands, and undernarrates the artistic expression and innovation taking place among communities within the region. That is why we at the Mellon Foundation are proud to have just announced our Frontera Cultural Fund, a $20 million philanthropic fund that will support arts organizations based in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands and led by my amazing Mellon colleagues, Deb Cullen-Morales and Cassandra Hernandez-Faham. It is the first large-scale instance of binational support for the arts along the frontera with an initial cohort of 32 organizations, and so we're very proud of that. So here today for our conversation to discuss the intersection of the arts in their own work, culture, and social justice in the Borderlands are our 3 extraordinary guest speakers, and I'm ready to introduce them. First, Cristina Ibarra is a widely celebrated filmmaker raised in the borderlands of El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Her documentaries and narrative shorts have been broadcast nationally on PBS and earned her multiple awards from the Sundance Film Festival. She's currently a professor at Arizona State University and is a 2021 recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant. Welcome, Cristina.
Thank you.
Julián Castro. Hello. Julián Castro is a nationally renowned public servant who currently leads the Latino Community Foundation, the largest Latino-serving philanthropy in the United States. He was born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, was elected city council member at age 26, and became the city's youngest ever mayor at age 34. From 2014 to 2017, he served as the 16th United States Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Barack Obama. Welcome, Julián Castro.
Thank you.
And Dr. Patrisia Gonzales is, hello. It's wonderful to see you. Yes, we go 100 years back and haven't seen each other in a very long time. It's beautiful to see you, to see your face. She is a distinguished scholar, teacher, and practitioner of traditional indigenous medicine. A descendant of Kickapoo, Comanche, and Massachusetts peoples, she is trained in multiple traditional health practices, including midwifery and herbalism. Previously an award-winning and extraordinary human rights journalist, she now teaches at the University of Arizona and is the author of the first ever textbook on American Indian medicines. Welcome, Patricia. And so, Cristina, Julián, and Patricia, we are so glad that you're here. Thank you for joining us today, and we will jump into our conversation. I'd like to open up with a question for the three of you to answer broadly, expansively, however you wish. What does the word Borderlands mean to you? And Patricia, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm speaking now from the lands of the Tohono O'odham and the Pasquayaqui tribe nations in what we know today as Tucson, Arizona. And when I looked at that word, I was like, I really, over time, have trained myself to look at the land through sovereign nations, through originality, what the Dr. Inés Hernández Ávila, who's Nez Perce and Tejana, talks about as originality, and to really think about place and these terrains and territories as much as we can identify the original caretakers of a place. And of course, in Texas, that was erased greatly. And yet we know there were hundreds of indigenous distinct peoples in Texas, where I grew up. And here, where I live, we have intact reservations. The O'odham is the longest reservation. It's the size of Connecticut, if I'm correct in that. And it is a place that teaches us, especially in the desert, about surviving and endurance. So when we go back to looking at the originality of a place, particularly as it was created with human beings and with the animals and the plants that create our languages, the environment and land, and the force of the sun in a particular place, the movement of the stars, all of these things that created indigenous knowledges, that is the borderland, but it's a borderland that's been imposed over sovereign peoples. And yet sovereign peoples continue, and we endure. And we endure because of the ceremonial fortitude and prayers that our ancestors left for us to live within today. And so those prayers are now in the present. And so when I think of the border, I also think it's really a place about, we talk about this convergence of peoples, and it is that place. There's a geopolitical reality. But it's really about movement. It's about movement and mobility. And so indigenous peoples, we have always moved across lands and been mobile. And so there's this contestation of those geopolitical borders when we choose to move across and assert our rights, whether we have treaty rights or not. And today, as we have another round of migration, a very robust presence now of more indigenous migrants coming from south of the border, from across the Americas, along with all the other peoples that are coming out of human desperation. But that mobility is also about moving in and out of identities, being forced and dislocated out of identities and being categorized into nation state identities. So a person is now Mexican or Guatemalan, and yet they may have still peoplehood. They may have very specific peoplehood. And because of colonization, the Mexican gets created out of this detribalization that has happened over time as a result of that same colonization that has created these various nation-state borders that are realities. And they impact people like the O'odham because the migration is being funneled and forced through U.S. policy into the harshest terrains, these terrains that teach us so much, and onto tribal lands. So it's important when we talk about the borderlands to remember that everything is happening on Indian lands. because this is all Indian country. But for now, at this particular moment, we have these geopolitical borders. So I would just say that to start off with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Julián, what are your thoughts on that word, borderlands?
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for having all of us, and it's great to see my fellow panelists as well. You know, when I think of the borderlands, I think of blending, of mixture, of cultures, of people, of languages, of skin color, of just the customs as well. I grew up mostly with my mother and my grandmother had come across the border, the physical border, from northern Mexico to the United States in 1922 because her parents had passed away and her nearest relatives lived in San Antonio, about 2.5, 3 hours north of the Mexican border. And when I was growing up, I remember hearing about going across the border and almost with a camaraderie and a sense of familia, of family, and this blending of cultures. And my grandmother and other elders talking about the indigenous influence and the mestizaje, or the blending of white and indigenous. And so when I think of our borderlands, I think of it very much that way, of a place that is a mixture, and yet at the same time does still have some very defined elements of each individual culture and language and custom. So a very special place, and one also that I think of in three-dimensional terms, so to speak, even though today, as I know we're going to discuss, it's so one-dimensionalized when we think about the border and the borderlands, which is such a tragedy, because anybody who spent any amount of time there can tell you that it's not that.
Thank you. Thank you. And Cristina, borderlands.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm gonna jump in here and explain the way that I look at the borderlands. It's really an honor to be here with these guests, by the way. Thank you for hosting this conversation. But for me, the borderlands, I do see it as my homeland. It's where I grew up. And it was a place that I didn't think about much growing up until I left. And I started to read Chicano theory. Specifically, Gloria Anzaldúa changed my life with her book, Borderlands. She described it in many ways, but one of the ways that sticks with me is she described it as a place that is in a constant state of transition. It's a scar that's always trying to heal itself. You know, it's always recreating and recreating. And that really stuck with me because I really started to think about the borderlands as a metaphor for my work. And I started to see it as what it is. When I looked at it more clearly, it's like this crossroads. It's yes, it's everything that we know it to be from the headlines somewhat, and it is a place for sure, obviously, but it's much more than that. It's a place, like Julián was mentioning, so we speak English and we speak Spanish. We're both colonized and we're indigenous, we're mestizo. And, I was growing up watching both Corazón Salvaje and 21 Jump Street, so as a filmmaker, I love this hybridity that I was seeing. And I do think that it's a place that's overlooked as an inventive, playful place. I mean, we invented Spanglish the same way that we mix these two languages together. We can think about it as we think about other parts of our country's identity, and think about this question of how do we create a sense of belonging? Maybe the borderlands has lessons to learn, and maybe it's not just this spectacle that we see in the news, but maybe there's some richness and history, and maybe there is definitely, so let's talk about that as well.
I'm so glad that you mentioned Borderlands La Frontera, the Anzaldúa, because I think that was certainly the first time I ever heard the word would have been the mid-'80s from reading that book. That was also very life-changing for me, as you say, as process. And in a larger conversation, a larger theoretical conversation of women of color trying to name our experiences and our processes. So, she's in conversation with Audre Lorde in thinking about scars, movement, evolution, healing, process, non-static. And so it's exciting to hear you talk. I'm talking about that from the world of ideas and feminist community building, and you're talking about it from place. So I love the idea that a gorgeous writer, poet, and thinker, it gives so many of us so much to think about that
It
she
lives
wrote 40
on.
years ago. Yeah, exactly. So just thank you for that moment. And so each of you also carries so many cultures, and some of these questions we're going broad, so you can go specific because there's so much to say. But you carry cultures, lessons, perspectives into your work with other audiences, the way that you take what you have and offer it to people. So Cristina, primarily in film, Patrisia, teacher, writer, healer, once a journalist, Julián, public service, and even that is just going to primary aspects of your work. So if you could each talk about how you came to your primary work mode and what it offers you for the experience of communicating across cultures and out of Borderlands knowledge and knowing. And maybe, Cristina, we could start right back with you.
Yeah, for sure. I was noticing that there were so many ideas that I was learning as a first one to go to college in my family that I wanted to share back home with my folks. But I didn't have the language. I couldn't quite do it in Spanish. It felt kind of broken. I couldn't do it in English because there was like a cultural divide. And I saw that film and television was easier for my family to pick up and watch than maybe a book or a newspaper. So I turned to film to try to express these ideas. And what I noticed by being really specific to talking about the way that I grew up with quinceañeras and Spanglish and crossing back and forth, even like the details of like a 4x4 monster truck that some of my family members love, like these kinds of details that I thought nobody cares about this stuff. I found that being very specific actually transferred the work or carried the work across a bridge of sorts, and it reached a wider audience that I was happily surprised by. I still remember showing that very first film about a quinceañera and a 12-year-old discovering her sexuality in New York at the African American Women in Cinema conference. And there was this I was in my early 20s. There was a middle-aged African American woman who came up to me and said, "That 12-year-old in your film, that's me. That's how I grew up." And I was so happy that she came to tell me that, because that's a lesson that I learned that I carry with me to this day. It's like the more that we try to fit in, you're not really going to reach that divide. It's just by being human, showing empathy, having a narrative, a story. This is how I came to film, is really trying to speak to the lived realities that I didn't see represented when I was growing up.
And if you could say more about like coming to film, because film takes equipment and it takes other people and it takes a certain amount of resource. So how did you find your way to that medium?
So it's true. Film at the time when I was learning it was a very difficult project to pull off because of what you just mentioned. And so the way that I came to it is by just trying to find the intention of what I was trying to do. So if I thought about why is it that I'm trying to speak? What am I trying to say? Who is this for? Then I'm able to then put the story together with a team of people. I can reach out to like-minded community members, try to raise my own infrastructure, because even though there's this desire to represent, there isn't this sturdy mechanism with which to do it. It's like you're encouraged to, in the film school that I ended up going to film school, even though I was supposed to study legal. I was supposed to be a lawyer or a doctor. Those were my two choices. So I ended up coming to film because I found that it was an urgent place for me. It was the reason I wanted to study law or medicine is because I was trying to find a way to heal my family, my community. But I thought film is definitely a way where I can best do it. I'm not sure if you're trying to get at like how expensive it is. and the amount of people that it takes, because there's just no room to get that support if you're not going to tell that dominant narrative story of the border. Like that's very true. So it's just like a do-it-yourself mentality, going in and using that, that rascuache aesthetic, that rascuache theory of Tomás Ibarra Fraustos. With you do what you can, you reappropriate, you really recycle, you tell something new out of old materials that don't work anymore. So it really works at a physical level as well as a conceptual level, like there's a tangibleness in film with these ideas of like, how do you create a borderland out of like these remnants of things, I hope I'm answering your question.
Actually wasn't, well, and I wasn't that, I love that I wasn't thinking about how, when you get into more resources that you're also having to counter a dominant narrative. And I'm so glad that you made that point. But was also just thinking about the sensibilities of a storyteller and how they spring one way or spring another way. And so thank you for answering that. Patricia, how would you talk about making your way to your tools?
Wow. Well, I was thinking about my grandparents right away. My grandmother told the best jokes, and my grandmothers really wanted me to remember who we were. So they would tell me these stories about how the women survived by being hidden, during the Mexican Revolution, and how we traveled by night to not be detected during very difficult periods of Texas when both indigenous peoples and Mexicans could be hung. And they had very, public trees for you to, or our families survived escaping massacres. But then great jokes. And my mama has a great joke. And my mom lives with me now, and she's almost 90. I think she's somewhere in here in Mellon land on virtual. And I'm just, her cadence of talking I realized that's where I got my sense of rhythm in writing. And the same thing, yeah, and my grandpa and my grandma were always telling these stories about how we had to stand with the prove, which was a way of saying to stand with the poor people, to stand with the people. And so, as you know, Elizabeth and I, Dr. Alexander and I met each other when we were in our 20s, way back when, both writers.
Long time ago.
And so,
yeah.
And so I was so fortunate that as a journalist, I worked for many different newspapers, and I covered the border. I covered the border in South Texas, and I covered the border here in Southern Arizona. But I had to cover things like train wrecks, and then I was covering the migration of indigenous Mayans and Salvadorians with the Underground Railroad as they were coming into Tucson, escaping the Civil War. And that's why I was sent to cover the war in Guatemala, and was able to interview Rigoberta Menchú. I think I was one of the first U.S. journalists that was able to tell her story. So I had this ability, for some reason, to go into people's lives, and they would talk to me. And what I really love about covering some of the stories I remember about the border that I think kind of showed me being a product of the Native and Chicano and Black civil rights movement was that I was always showing people their dignity and their ability to act. And so I would interview little shoeshine boys making a living up in Agua Prieta, or people living on dumps in their houses, or they worked and they were called the tiribichis, and they would collect and make their living off the dumps, or Cartonlandia, which were carton homes that were villages in themselves in very urban areas of Nogales, Mexico, and to show their ability to endure, and their ability, their innate dignity and power. And so I even though I wasn't, as journalists, we're supposed to be objective, I was very subjective in the sense of that, to show not people that, that they're the reality of poverty, but that what emerges, from the potential of human beings within that context, whatever our context is. So, I guess that was my process. I've always been a nonfiction writer. And so when I, got my PhD, we had written, my late ex-husband and I had already written several books together of our columns because I became a syndicated columnist with him. And we were always telling stories that, again, about Indigenous rights, about human rights, about civil rights, and got censored a lot for that. But we were very clear that we were going to make that stand no matter what the cost was. And it cost us our column eventually. We went through a lot of censorship after 9/11. When I started to write Red Medicine, I don't know should I just stop there? Because I could keep going, or if you still want me to talk about the
No,
creative process.
keep
Yeah.
going, keep going. Yep.
And it goes to this idea of, how we become formed as peoples. And it does, and the border is part of that experience, in that as we become confined, right? Confined by terminology, by how we're defined, by what our rules are defined by colonization, by oppression, by norms. How then do we how we become dislocated from our knowledge? And yet I could see, because of my family and the indigenous medicine that was in my family, my great grandpa, several of my elders were the healers in our community. And now they're trying to create a historical landmark of my great grandpa's house where he doctored in Texas, where I grew up. And so I was really looking at taking all the skills that I had as a journalist and trying to sound as understandable as possible when you become an academic and a scholar. As you know, we kind of go into that theoretical terrain, but to really show how there is a persistence of knowledge through our visual languages, through our visual forms, through what people call symbols that are actually ceremonial formulas of, so unpacking all of these words to really center it from what I had learned from my family, and then from being with elders since 1990, with many Masawal elders who took me in because of my own family's lineage, and really trying to, from an indigenous lens, re-articulate what had been written about us that really was not capturing how we understood ourselves. And I think that's part of this, these multiple realities that we have, and so important to tell the stories, that is to understand the power of story. It's alive. And that's one thing, one of the elders, she was in my book, The Mud People, and she's in San Antonio, Grandma Emma, and she said, we were in this circle, it was called the Turtle Island Legend Keepers. And she says, the story has a reason for wanting to be told. The story knows what to do. So that aliveness of stories, the aliveness of stories in and of themselves.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. What I remember so well about your journalism is how it sort of burst the frame of the Philadelphia Inquirer, right? I mean, there was a vibrating humanity and beauty and soul that you were able to bring forward within the journalistic language that was highly unusual to see. And so it's not surprising to hear that. I love how people burst the frames of their own knowledge and ability and expressivity and knowledge of gift, to take it forward to the next stages. So thank you. Julián, what about you and your gift and your giving, and how you've come to know it?
Yeah, well, mostly it's because I had a hellraiser for a mom. My mom, her name is Rosie, or Maria del Rosario, Rosie Castro. She was a Chicana activist, mostly in the 1970s. And she was an only child to my grandmother that I mentioned that had come from Coahuila. My grandmother, because I grew up with both of them, my grandmother was the type of woman who was very traditional. She would still wear a veil, for instance, when she went to church. And she did not, if there was something political on TV, for instance, and we were watching it, she didn't show much interest or told us to change the channel to watch something. She wanted to watch her telenovelas or Sábado Gigante or something else. But my mom, even though she had gone through 12 years of Catholic school, and then another 4 years at Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, kind of took the complete opposite approach, and eventually ran for city council, and when she was 23 years old in 1971, at a time before there were single-member districts in San Antonio. So very few women and very few people of color actually had a chance to win. She didn't, but she went on to be a chair for Bexar County, which includes San Antonio, in La Raza Unida Party, which, for those who are not familiar, at the time was a third party that said that neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party was serving the needs of Mexican Americans in the Southwest. And so they ran their own slates of candidates. And my mom was involved in that. And so I grew up in a household where identity was very much a part of our upbringing. And, but identity is expressed through trying to work in the democratic process to make life better for the community, and particularly for Mexican Americans there in San Antonio. And I watched that. I watched my mom go to organizing meetings and participate in rallies and marches and drag us to hand out flyers on election day for candidates and for different issues. Watch things like her involvement in 1991 when we were in high school. My brother Joaquin and I have a twin brother, Joaquin, and Maria Antonieta Berriozábal was running to try and become the first Latina ever elected mayor of the city of San Antonio, that by that time was well over 50% Latino. And so that's how I gained sort of the political consciousness, and also a sense of identity and of place in the world. And when I went away to college to Stanford with my brother, it was the first time that I got to see another world and to see my community through the eyes of an outsider. And realize that, wow, in this place that was so much more diverse there in Palo Alto, California, on that campus, I had grown up in a community that was right around me, at least in the west side of San Antonio, was probably 90% Mexican American. And my high school was, 85% or so Mexican American. And so in some ways, very sheltered, and one might say, limited, but also in a lot of ways, very comfortable. And also, I think it strengthened me and gave me confidence in different ways. And the process of coming into seeking public office was really about feeling like that was an effective way to help lift others up. And, managing that, like, when you run for office, right, you're being voted on by everybody of different backgrounds, right? And you have to serve everybody that you're elected to represent. At the same time, my original inclination to go into it really was tied up in this chip on my shoulder about my hometown, and especially that more young Latinas and Latinos did not have the kind of opportunity that I saw Joaquin and me having there, and a wanting to go home and to do something about that, to create more opportunity for them. I credit that to my mom, who I think, set an example and also gave us an anchor ideologically. Obviously you never agree 100% with your parents and so forth. But I think that in so many ways, she established a very strong foundation for us. And even now, I find myself in moments like a lot of us do with our own parents of thinking, oh, what would she think? Or how would she approach this? I used to do that quite a bit, when I was serving on the city council or as mayor or even at HUD. And so I'm very grateful for that.
Well, and that's one thing I wondered, is moving from the more local, politics in the place you come from, to politics on a national scale. And I wonder what it is, when your work became national, what are some of the, maybe, one or two most profound understandings that you brought with you from home?
You know, I think that what I saw in San Antonio when I became mayor, especially because in order to get elected mayor there, even though it's a city that is now 64% Latino, and about 75% people of color, because of the voting patterns, you have to build a broad coalition of people. And so, it gave me confidence that that coalition building was possible, that you could make progress in that way. And also, it really showed me that I was part of a blessed generation. And by that, I mean blessed with opportunities that my mother and certainly my grandmother never would have had, you know. And so it gave me like a spirit and an energy to be ambitious about trying to propose and trying to effectuate change. And so when I was at HUD, for instance, I got to travel to like 99 or 100 different communities as part of that in 2.5 years. Most of them big cities, but some smaller towns and medium-sized communities. And it always amazed me how they were trying to build coalitions there or failing to build coalitions sometimes. And that's something that I took with me and often talked about the need to do to be successful.
I love what you said. I'm stuck on what you said about being part of a blessed generation. And I think that it's so interesting to think of ourselves in history. And so I wonder if Cristina and Patricia, you could reflect a little bit on your generation in place. Because again, what this is sort of taking me to, not a foregone conclusion, but I think about how incredibly fraught and how contentious and dark our times are in certain ways, that sometimes might feel at odds of what we might have hoped was the forward movement of a generation. So just both of your thoughts about your generation.
Patricia.
Okay, well, I'm 65, so I am reflecting on life and the elders that I've known. When you were mentioning Julián, I knew his mom. Okay, she had the best hats. Okay, this woman has a presence. Red hats. Yeah, it was really cool, red hats. And she gave you your chops. And people like that, so like I mentioned, my grandparents, some of them were born in the 1800s. I actually had people that raised me who were born in the 1800s. And and that, there's a certain osmosis that happens from the legacy of having someone in another period like that and in your life. And but then at the political level, the movements that I was like I was a kid, I was like a teen and a preteen when at the at the height of the different movements. But I also remember when Kennedy was shot. I was with my grandma. I remember when they announced me MLK, and Bobby, and so I have that memory of what it's like to go into places and they tell you you can't go in there, because of your color of your skin, or being afraid to go down certain streets because you knew to stay away because it wasn't safe because of who we were. So but also knowing people like Dolores Huerta and so many Chicano and Chicana civil rights activists, chiefs, I'm so honored to have met so many Native chiefs who were going to the UN from the 70s, actually from the 40s and into the 70s because it was important that they were the first to say we needed the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. So just being around all these people who believe, that they believed that it was possible, and and going back to this idea of story, they had to tell our story. It was important to come and tell our story. And my own tribe, like knowing elders who negotiated our the right that we had through treaty rights to be recognized as a federally recognized tribe, and them hearing their strategies for how they went about that. what I think it left with me is the ability to believe what is possible in the face of no semblance that it's there. You know, it's believing in that unseen. Yes, it's believing in that unseen, and also knowing what they endured. I mean, you know, Julián's, probably all of our parents, right? All of our parents underwent the deep Jim Crow, you know, anti-Indian, anti-Mexican legislation. I had a poll tax poster that I just donated to special collections, you know. So that's the reality in my own life, that, you know, that we were prevented from voting, or, you know, there would be constraints on us. And so I think that that those are constraints, you know, so talking about creativity and busting out of the constraints, there's so many ways that we have, there's there's an attempt to tame us. And that goes back to land again, and what we represent often as Indigenous peoples, or as people of color, or as intelligent people, or as people who have a voice and are challenging the other narratives that are not the master narrative, because our stories are the master narratives. You know, our stories are but there's been this imposed narrative. So I think that's the beauty of the legacy, is that we have the freedom now, much more than they did, to be able to reconstitute our stories and to make our experience more whole.
Thank you. Cristina, generation.
Yeah, I experienced what they called Generation Ñ. And Patricia, I experienced the when Selena got shot. That's my reference, my frame. And yeah, you know, so just speaking about my generation, you know, I inherited some of the early learnings from the early Chicano cinema, you know, like Luis Valdez, Lourdes Portillo. So there were some groundbreakers out there that I was seeing, and I was thinking about how I can update that work, and how I can add to that, be in conversation with that generation of filmmakers, but also more personally to the generation of my family. When I think about my family, I think about border crossers, you know, because it's not like one single border crossing defines our legacy. It's just goes way back to generations of border crossers along the Camino Real, and thinking about Chicano cinema, thinking about how we're supposed to be Generation Ñ and coming up with these, you know, new narratives. And then thinking about the border crossers, putting that all together. I just really felt that my generation is almost like a lost generation, because it's a generation that has a lot to say about today's realities and the social experiences that we live in, but we don't have the infrastructure. The mechanisms of visual language that exist today, they don't care about our generation of border storytellers. And so it really is up to us to look at this previous generation of our families and of filmmakers, and try to build a path that's alternate, or that bypasses the traditional paths. So when I think about my generation, yeah, I'm thinking about, yeah, how do you continually like use what you have and just reinvent, you know, and just try to reclaim this, like, you know, like you mentioned, Patricia, these lost stories, this lost history that we need to reclaim.
I'd like to stay with you, Cristina, because I'm thinking about how many Borderlands artists today are engaged very deeply with the political and ethical concerns surrounding specific questions of the U.S.-Mexico border. And some address it directly, and some are more abstract in the range of ways that artists will make their art. So if you could talk a little bit about, you know, some artists, some work that you're excited about, that you're interested in or challenged by. Well, let's start there.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think that there are folks who are pushing back, and I'm looking at Ileana Sosa, and the work that she does. She's another Albasoan with her documentary work, and I'm looking at Isabel Castro and the work that she's doing with Mija. I'm looking at someone like Chico McMurtry, who is creating these robotic sculptures and creating border crossers through this other
Wow.
technology. It's really fascinating, and it's really claiming that space as a place that is a playground as well as a place that has a heavy burden, and it's mixing with these ideas. But also outside of film, there's journalism like El Paso Matters that's working with La Verdad, newspaper in Juarez. They're collaborating. There's Fem Frontera in El Paso that's really interested in commissioning collaborations binationally. So you have a filmmaker in the United States, a filmmaker in Juarez. So there are these attempts to bridge cultures, to think about something beyond the wall. There are organizations in Laredo, like Entre, that are interested in experimental work, and the Laredo Film Society. I mean, yeah. So there's a movement. I'm not trying to to be too depressing here. I mean, there is a movement. There are folks who are working against the system. There's a legacy that we're building upon. There's a part of the ecosystem that's broken, and that's where I come in and try to think about, well, how can a place like Borderlands Studios, a nonprofit studio based in a university setting, how can that be an alternate path to create work at a higher level? Let's scale up this work. Let's talk to more people. Let's infiltrate the mainstream message of the border.
I just have to go back for a minute to Chico McMurtry is who did the robotic border crossers.
That's correct. Yeah, Chico McMurtry.
Yeah. So do you experience that because someone's filmed it, or do you experience it in person, or how? Could you describe it a little bit more?
Chico McMurtry creates these sculptures for a museum setting, for exhibition, but he also goes to the actual place, to the border itself, and you experience a performance of the border. You can participate, you can speak back. It's really a dialogue that he creates with his work, and the movement is really special.
Yeah, exciting, wonderful. Thank you. Continuing with Julián, who are you? What are you watching, interested in, who you think is engaging in a really vital way?
Yeah, well, now in my capacity at the Latino Community Foundation, we're doing something that's super exciting. A couple of years ago, we got a grant from the California Arts Council that started us off on a journey to support something called Poder Arte, that invests in 28 different Latina-led arts organizations. And I'm really excited about this because growing up with a Chicana activist mom, like I remember, hearing about and then getting to watch some of the work of the Teatro Campesino on film, and watching the Valdez brothers, and watching movies that were both mainstream movies, but also it touched me because I didn't see that many people reflected on in film, the way that others would in the mainstream stuff, like Zoot Suit and La Bamba and other movies, and reading poems like I Am Joaquin, the Patrisia Gonzales poem, and these works that influence the movement. And so I have really believed, I know like a lot of people for a long time, that arts and music, that it can move people, it can make change, and do so in a powerful way, in a way that is different. It touches people differently than, just writing, or just, a politician speaking, or some other way, or somebody governing, or even in some ways, sometimes organizers organizing in traditional ways, knocking on your door or something. And what's exciting is that these are often organizations that are doing a combination. They are blending that. To me, that's exciting, to make change. And And then, these days I have political whiplash because I'm spending a lot of my time in California, but then also still based in Texas. So I go from one to the other. And in Texas, I mean, they're just folks doing phenomenal work. In my backyard of San Antonio, Cruz Ortiz, for instance, and Olivia Ortiz together are doing some really great work there about Chicanismo and Chicanismo and this Borderlands and trying to take that into new venues. And so all of that is very exciting.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Patrisia, and if you could also talk about the very unique superpower of the imagination. I feel like you will have something to say about that. But yeah.
You were asking me about what I'm listening to and
so,
thinking about? Okay.
Well, that you think, I mean, like, grounding in engaging, broadly speaking, questions of the U.S.-Mexico border, borderlands issues. Who do you think, what are you seeing that you think is dynamic? But I'd also love to hear you talk about imagination.
Oh, wow. Well, it's just so, I've been in all these workshops with amazing artists. I can't even, all their names is there's like alphabet soup. There's so many people. I think they've named so many wonderful ones. One thing that I see here on this part, over time, I've seen some really interesting things like where people will do productions and they're right on the border. So you have like Nogales, the two Nogaleses, and they're dancing and singing to each other across the border. Yeah, and really interesting digital media work, like with I just was looking at a Yaqui exhibit on where she's a Yaqui architect looking at the British Museum and looking at Yaqui space through a 3D kind of animation website. So I think there's so much potential right now with 3D, but I've worked with 3D with some of my medicine work, like we did a pop-up botanica and did a little bit of 3D with the students. And to do this kind of work, you really need, when we think about the Mellon supporting artists, when you start getting into this new media, it changes so fast that you really need a lot of funding because it just keeps changing so quickly that everything, the equipment you buy can be antiquated in a year. But yet it's so dynamic, some of the 3D work that I see people doing in animation. And I see bloggers, just like, so what I think is interesting because, having been in a newspaper, and really, I'm still a newspaper person. You're like, I want to have the physical to read. But what I think is really dynamic, and that's where I think that freedom comes in, is just seeing all of these native bloggers and indigenous bloggers and, all kinds of people of color doing interesting work. Of course, I don't, I think, I don't get a lot on TikTok and all that because I'm recovering from a concussion. So I can't be on the internet a lot. But every once in a while, I get, these links to people doing really interesting, inspirational, leaving messages of hope and from their own perspective as this new generation. So I think that's what I just see in the community that I think is really remarkable of being able to break out of, again, these constrictions of kind of standard media to take ownership of their story, of the message, of even communicating what's happening on the ground around missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. There's this, and this is where I think is as maybe distinct with Indigenous peoples is that we have that ceremonial foundation that then gets expressed creatively to inform our people of what's happening. And it's something that I've always seen. I remember being on a bus in Mexico City. This is back in like 1983. And they would hand out these little mimeographed stories telling how their communities had been besieged because that was the only access they had to tell the people what had happened to in their communities of violence, right? State violence. And you go from that to now native bloggers and native rappers. Some of the native rappers are so cool because they're in their native language. And somehow the rap really goes with the native language, I think, even better than Spanish and English, because our accents are not all in the same, they're in these different, the language has these different emphasis. And it's really dynamic to see Quechua rappers and different rappers in Mayan languages and how that's communicating. And these young people are in this world, right? Being influenced by all the things that young folks are being influenced globally and making it theirs in their own languages. And that allows the language to live again and to continue, because we have to speak the language for the language to be lived. For the language to survive, our languages to survive, we have to stay in the language. And it's, as someone who's a language learner, we know how hard it is you're learning a language, to be able to that language to really live and become deeper, because you have to have other people sharing with you in the language for it to live. So, so imagination. Wow. Well, I would say that we believe that we are imagining, but we are the ones being imagined. Yeah. There's something greater out there that helps to create us. And I think, as someone who catches babies and works with medicine and as a writer, that ability to tap into the spiritual world, the unseen world, the natural world, which nature is profoundly physical and profoundly spiritual. Those practices are what then comes through us then to create, as we really seek and ponder and are reflective, to pull out from within us, right? Something that we're trying to create. All of us have written Julián's written a book, Cristina, you're a filmmaker. You have these wonderful poems, Elizabeth, your wonderful poetry. And that process is, it's like something is coming through us. And sometimes it's exhausting, to create it. There's this level of exhaustion. It is like when we say that, like birth, because our bodies change from these words and ideas flowing through us and then finally getting into a physical form, however it is. But there's a process where it unites with our own effort, our effort to seek, right, to express. And then what comes through us that wants to be expressed, and we're finally the ones that are able to allow it to flow through us into this physical form that is whatever, what we're creating. And that's the same thing with midwifery, to be able to listen or healing, to be able to tap into and be able to hear, something that is telling us, don't go that way, or yes, do this, or it's contraindicated, but this is what must be done. That's being communicated from another dimension of experience. It can be. Aside from what we're learned, telling us, there's certain practicum that we follow to be safe or to be effective in our art form. Healing arts and the arts, they're different expressions. They're actually considered both art forms.
Yeah, thank you. I'm hearing some words I've always loved from the poet Derek Walcott from St. Lucia, and he's talking about bringing together many aspects of experience and identity. And he said, "I had no nation but the imagination," which is to say that out of many out of many things, out of many experiences, out of many realms of knowledge and experience, I think also imagination is the infinite joiner of all of those things. And you all have given us so many. Thank you for all of these. I know sometimes it's hard to do the name checking, but you've given us dozens of people's work to look at and forms to think about, and that's really quite a gift. There are a lot of terrific questions, so I'm going to ask questions, and just anybody jump for the ball. It's jump ball. I say in honor of the New York Liberty national champions. Just wanted to say that even in our Borderlands conversation, we had to have a little New York moment, so we have a basketball metaphor. The first question here, again, there are just so very, very, very many. This one is coming from DC. And the question is, in order to create spaces that preserve diversity, inclusion, and the transmission of art from artists with rich cultural backgrounds from other countries, especially those creating art in border spaces, that estoy aquí pero soy de allá space What cultural policies currently exist to support them? From your perspective, given our current demographic reality, do you believe these policies are sufficient? If not, what would you propose to improve their accessibility? And you can just take any piece of the question, because people, have a lot to offer in their questions.
Mhm. Well, I'll just jump in real quick with
Please.
a reference to public television. So, I mean, there's
Great.
policy right now that creates a space for media that is for the public good, right? It's supposed to be a diverse media, and I love PBS. I depend on it. But I believe that problem is so severe in terms of the lack of representation, or how we can do better to bring in specifically border voices, that we need more than what we have with PBS. So, there's some ideas going around, some talk from some artist-driven initiatives that are thinking about how public funds can be better distributed, more diversely distributed. And, perhaps what we need is a film board. Basically, there's some policies in place, but I think that they're not enough. And so I'm hopeful that some of these movements will yield within my generation, will yield some results so that we can see a more diverse filmmaking community.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Julián, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, right, if there's something I'm thinking about in that vein right now, that it's a time for courage among the leadership of institutions, whether it's foundations on our end that now, because of this Fearless Fund case, essentially is the beginning of a challenge to foundations that are investing in Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, to museums and other arts organizations that all of us know for forever have not been as diverse or inclusive or equitable as we would like them to be, and sometimes as they would like to be, right? And they are trying.
Yeah.
But especially now, where we've seen post the murder of George Floyd and the commitments that were made 4 years ago in 2020, and now going in the other direction, I hope that if there's a quality that we can, that leaders can be moved to really display its courage and commitment to positioning institutions to embrace diverse stories and work and narratives, to invest in that, and not to be cowed by what is a very deliberate and intentional and legal push to try and silence those stories and that experience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Here is a question that is, what gets occluded or flattened by the notion of the borderlands? What does borderlands as a term hide or flatten?
Sovereignty.
Mm.
Sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is a great answer. Thank you, Patricia. But but yes, for sure. But I would add to that, but I don't know if I want to make sure you're finished, but I would add a little bit to that. I feel like thinking about the borderlands, I think that the idea of what gets flattened is this idea that the border is just the U.S.-Mexico border, or like Canada. It's more than that. We take these borders with us everywhere we go. So when we think about the border, we flatten the story by just thinking about what's on the headlines. I just encourage us to really think about how we think about borders, or rather how we implement borders ourselves, and what are those internal challenges? Be like, there's class, there's gender, there's there's colonialism. I mean, there's just there are so many borders that try to keep us in place. And so let's just think about how to be free of those and move, like we don't. And anyway, I'm not sure what gets flattened exactly, but what I do know is that the the conversation itself is flat. Like we need to think about those multiple ways of thinking about the mentality of the border.
Yeah.
I wanted, I'm sorry, Julián, did you want to say something?
No, please. Yeah, I can go. I'll go afterward. Yeah.
Well, I want to say a little bit about the history of the Alianza. So the Indigenous Alliance Without Borders, we're almost 30 years old, and we were formed by tribal elders because every time immigration was spoken of, there was no like contextualization of the indigenous, sovereignty, indigenous experiences, native crossing rights, because federally recognized tribes have crossing rights, rights of mobility and passage, which we're seeing now with indigenous migrants that are coming through, the importance of them having representation in their languages. We've documented that at least 20% of the people coming through the southern door of Arizona that beats into Tucson speak a native language, and they have the right to have represent. Their primary language is indigenous, so they have that language right to be represented. So I think that's that flattening again when we base it on it becomes flattened by those all-encompassing nation-state ideas, and that's that larger imaginary. When we think about that flattens that because that's those are colonial concepts, and so all this diversity that we're seeing at the border now, with so many different peoples coming to seek refuge from all over the world, right? That gets flattened as illegal immigration, or just migrants, with of course a lot of other pejorative terms that people are using.
Yeah, I mean, in that vein, I would just that just the fluidity of it, right? The relationships that exist across. It's oftentimes, that there's this sense that there's here and there's there, right? But people, in many ways, exist as families on both sides, as friends on both sides, co-workers, sometimes classmates, and then also, in the political conversation, without getting partisan on it, but the political conversation, for instance, in Texas, in the borderlands there, right? One of the big stories coming out of 2020 was, how did Donald Trump do better in some of these South Texas counties near the border, right? And like what gets flattened is just that, that people continue to be three-dimensional human beings there. That's an area that's very militarized. A lot of people working in law enforcement, for instance. Those are relatively, small town and even rural communities there that otherwise match sort of the migration of those communities, and even more so to support Donald Trump, for instance. And so the fullness of people's identities, as well as their connections, their history, a lot of that gets one-dimensionalized in our conversation about the border.
I wanted just to quickly mention, I know I already spoke, but just really quickly, please. Thank you. We had this, our first event at the Borderlands Studios a few weeks ago, and we convened interdisciplinary storytellers, interdisciplinary border storytellers. And what came out of these conversations were, we were speaking with organizers, historians, journalists, filmmakers, playwrights, novelists, all sorts of disciplines, all sorts of perspectives. And what really came out of all these conversations is the sense that we, from all of these different angles and themes that we think about, whether it's like Black Lives Matter, whether it's the Chinese Exclusion Act, whether it's the border itself as a physical place, or migration, all of these conversations can be embodied when we think about what is a border storyteller. And so the question of what gets flattened is a hard one, because I'm coming at this trying to cultivate this sense that the border is everybody. It's not just the U.S.-Mexico border, but we all have to deal with it, and all over the country.
Thank you. We are just about at time, so I would love each of you to just leave us with, and this has been such a rich and wide-ranging conversation, and I thank you so much. I'm gonna thank you a second time, but I want to thank you for being expansive and open and taking the conversation to many, many different places. So what would you each like to ground us with, and leave us with a final thought from each of you. Perhaps we could start with you, Patricia.
Well, those of us who are on the border know how the land is tough. Let me tell you. You walk around the borderlands, right on the border. The terrain is often very harsh, and it teaches us something. It really does, and it forms us. But I think that something that I have written about that I think is important to remember, and that is that, and this is why I think I wrote Red Medicine. Part of it was to show that our knowledge, our prayers, our strength of spirit, our intelligence, and all those who've come before us that prayed us up to be here, that is more powerful than colonization. And that is the power that comes from this incredible pulse of the universe, this intelligence that creates life, that's where creativity emerges from. All of that is available to us, and that is how we survived, in that belief that what we hold, what runs through our veins, from whether we're aware of it or not, that made life, that allowed all of our elders to survive very difficult times. It is possible for us to allow that to emerge within us, and it is more powerful. It is more powerful than any man-made laws, any man-made, human-made oppressions. And we have to keep reminding ourselves of that into the next generation of folks, this next generation that is coming forward to be able to really have confidence that we will continue.
Thank you. Cristina.
I mean, I love your question about imagination, or asking us to think about imagination. And I would say that that's a really nice place to end, because I feel like there's I depend on it. It's my tool. I need it to depend on it to be able to create films. But I feel like imagination is one part, and we have that now. So I would ask, we're all part of the solution of how we can create a more equitable and just world, a more equitable narrative of the border. So I would say to also think about imagination when you move forward and try to build alternatives and pathways. Don't use that imagination to disrupt the status quo. I think that would just be like my call, or like my ending, is just like, think about, we have imagination, and now what do we do with it? Let's come together.
Yes. Thank you. Julián.
Yeah, as much as the border and the borderlands, those areas are projected these days as places of danger and of desperation, and something that is negative and bad by a lot of people, right, that talk in these ways, especially around an election. I think of it as a place of hope, of aspiration, where generations of people have come with huge dreams and a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of love for their family and for both countries, or their country and the country that they want to make a life in here in the United States, and then those who are making a life on either side of the border. And so I think of it in those ways, in a positive, inspiring way, and with a recognition that we need one another. That's always been true. It doesn't matter how negative, how dark the rhetoric gets. There's a fundamental truism that we need one another, and will continue to need one another.
Okay, well, muchísimas gracias amigos, beautiful people. Thank you. This was such a wonderful, I wish it could continue. So let it continue in other ways with each other, with all of you who are listening to the extraordinary chat where so many things are being said and thought and wondered and offered. The conversation continues. We do need each other. So thank you for leaving us in that place out of the extraordinary place that we came here to talk about today. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.